order the joint work session for April 27th, 2021. Do you need a roll call? Will someone? Or no?
Erica, are we taking note of who is in attendance?
Yes, I will do that.
Okay, so we have note of who's in attendance. All right, the meeting is called to order then.
And so I think I'm going to kick off the context and then turn it over to the mayor and council members and conversation. As I think you may know, I know the council knows there's a pre-application for a multifamily development within the Cedar Creek Plaza under the multifamily residential being allowed in a commercial zone if it's clearly secondary to a commercial use. And that sort of, and we've had some other interest around town of mixed use and commercial zones utilizing that standard. And so there was some question about what our current code would allow and whether or not we wanted to allow that. And so we wanted to have that conversation with the Planning Commission and the council. Currently, and I'll just read, multifamily housing is permitted in commercial zones subject to the dimensional requirements of the high-density residential zone in 16.12.030 when located on the upper floors in the rear of or otherwise clearly secondary to commercial buildings. And then there's a footnote to that clarifies the residential portion of a mixed-use development is considered secondary when traffic trips generated, dedicated parking spaces, signage, and the road frontage of residential uses are all exceeded by that of the commercial component, and the commercial portion of the site is located primarily on the ground floor. So that is what we have today, and I did a little bit of research earlier today. That standard and footnote was added in 2012, in part in response to some other developments that we'd had where there was a lot more multifamily than I think the city at the time wanted. But before that, as far back as 1987, the code allowed multifamily, or I don't know if it said multifamily, it allowed like apartments when secondary to commercial uses. So just so it's context, I was thinking that it had been put in as a result of a Metro standard, but I think it even predated Metro. So I think that's just kind of interesting. But as Joe said, when I told him that maybe mean that it's probably time to relook at it and just make sure we've got it right if it's been in the code for that long. So with that, I'll turn it over to the mayor to maybe discuss a little bit more about what you wanted to have a conversation about today.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you, Jean. Good to see everybody. A lot of our code and our zoning is all going to be reviewed as part of our comp plan, new comprehensive plan. And this provision was definitely going to be part of that. But as as we're getting through other things and we see the fog is clearing a little bit on things, I wanted to check in and make sure that to see if we want to touch upon this earlier than later, make sure we get what we want. My primary concern is preserving the commercial tax base of the commercial zone, industrial zone land that we have. We don't know if and when we'll get more from Metro. We'll be hoping to ask for more, but we don't know what Metro will be saying in the future. So while our 2012 code is much better than the previous code, I want to get feedback and perspective from others on what you all think about this. One way of kind of preserving the commercial value of that zone property is by saying, yes, let's still, follow a lot of the principles of the zoning as it states for mixed use, but say ground floor of all buildings needs to be commercial, and that it be treated truly like a mixed use building, and so that any housing element would be upstairs. So that's one idea, but I wanted to hear what other folks thought and perspectives. Doug, your hand?
Yeah, I got my hand up. So I think, ultimately I think as we go through the comp plan and we address this, or we look at all this code, we'll handle this. But I do agree that I don't know that we can risk waiting for that process to play out, because, right now there's, we could have a number of things happen and this commercial land be gobbled up in the shorter term for residential uses. And I think we have to address this in two ways. One, we don't really have a lot of available high density residential zone in the city right now. So I think, in absence of there being HDR zone that someone can go build high density in, this is an avenue for high density, construction to happen now. So I think ultimately, as we, hopefully, bring in more land in the not too distant future, we can look at, HDR, or we can look at what of the available HDR that is currently inside the city, what is causing it not to be developed, and, is there something we can do about that? So let's put that aside, because I think that isn't something we're going to answer today. I agree with the current. I think the current language is vague and therefore problematic. I think the language about secondary use is both of those things. I'd like to see more clear and objective language that protects the commercial use as the primary use in commercial zones. I think your suggestion of saying, ground floor must be commercial is one way of doing it. You could also say, a certain percentage of the ground floor of each building has to be commercial, or the full, or the whole site has to be, whether that's 75% or 50% or 51% or whatever, we can haggle over later. I think those are options. I think, getting away from the language around trips and parking and street frontage and all that, I think that I'd rather just completely take that out and have it be really primarily around, overall square footage and ground floor square footage being the primary metrics. And maybe there needs to be something about frontage, because maybe that's important. But that's my thoughts. I'd like to see more clear language and I think we can address this, in the short term pretty easily.
Cool. Tim, hands up.
Yeah, Doug, you covered a lot of what I was thinking. I would add, because Keith, you started us off talking about, we're going to address this when we get through the comprehensive plan review and then do our code updates. I'm concerned about waiting for similar reasons. There's a lot of we're coming out of the fog of COVID here. There's a lot of activity. There's potentially a lot of sites that because of that might be available in our commercial land that could get gobbled up in the short term here. I'm also very worried about the vagueness of the language at this point, especially in light.
You got muted, Tim.
I'm also worried about the vagueness of the language in the short term here, because especially in the light of the two recent LUBA appeals that cities lost. And I'm paraphrasing here, but when one of them, it said that they turned it down because the applicant didn't do the traffic study to the level that they wanted. They wanted more intersections examined, and because their language said it wasn't specific about how many traffic signals had to be examined, LUBA threw the whole thing out and ordered the city to approve the development. So there's obviously a trend in that area, and we need to make sure our language is really clear. That I think that'll be a big part of the update once we get through the final phases of the comprehensive plan here. But I am worried about this current language, given some of the activity that we're seeing out here in the short term.
Yeah, in the current language, if you, depending on how you want to interpret it, but if it was like the part, there's parts of the language that talks about trips, that you define housing as secondary if there is one fewer trips than the commercial. That's very problematic from my view, because pick a project and you put 2 fast food restaurants in there with drive-throughs. Those are huge trip generators. Then the rest of the could be mixed use when it's standalone housing. And I don't think that's what we might be, wanting in that metrics. So I think we can do better. The 2012 language came about because of our mixed use project, and it barely is.
Alexandra Brown
is now joining.
Awesome. Mixed use project next to the YMCA, and part of the requirement of that was the 3 or 4 or however many buildings that fronted 99, the ground floor had to be commercial. Those are bad examples of ground floor commercial, because they have 4 or 6, maybe even 8 staircases from the ground floor up to the townhomes, condos above, consuming all the ground floor, a whole lot of the ground floor stuff. So if their direction was to do, require ground floor commercial on all buildings, for instance, you'd also want to limit the number of stairwells, so that elevators are used or something.
Well, there's some examples over at Beaverton that I would not like either, where they have the ground floor is 80% parking and they put one little shop on a corner and call it mixed use. And I don't, the whole concept of mixed use was to put neighborhood shops out in the community so people didn't have to drive to them. Using this as a way to put a lot of high density residential in our commercial land doesn't seem like the right application of what that was originally intended for anyways.
Other comments? Doug, your hand is up again. No. Jean?
Yes, Mayor, thank you. I agree with you that weighting is of concern. I think if the comprehensive plan, or when the comprehensive plan gets updated, we're going to have a lot of other cleanup items that we're going to need to address. And if that gets bogged down in the process with so many other topic items, this may get lost or delayed as we go through hearings. And it seems like we can take what's a footnote and codify it with more strength, with better direction to staff, and make it a clear and objective standard that incorporates, maybe it's not or one of these items, but it's all of these items. It has to have upper floors, rear buildings, square footage of the floor, traffic, parking, and signage. So it's not an or of any of these, it's all of these have to comply to protect the commercial area.
Yep, and then there's something kind of odd in the language that talks about the housing portion of mixed use to do the HDR, high density zoning or density, but that's kind of a hard kind of thing to do. Maybe just as an idea, you say the maximum number of units could be so many per acre, based if they qualify in all the other categories, but then there's no minimum, so that if in one building the developer wants to pick a number of units on top of a building, great, those are extra units in the community, and that's better, our community's better because of it. But don't turn around and say, oh, you're going to build that building, so now you need to have 30 units in that building before you could do it. Maybe it's more appropriate to do just 5. I have no idea, but that was a little bit concerning if from an interpretation LUBA comment like that Tim was touching upon. So,
but comment and question. On the question to the council as a general, we are doing design standards. So would you see residential design standards applying to the high density residential, or excuse, and does it have to be high density residential is the other question. If we allow residential within the general commercial, could it be defined less than high density residential? So two questions. One,
Yep.
should the density be defined as high density residential? And what I read in the code is that it uses the design standards and setbacks for high density residential. And is that what you would want as the criteria for approving the buildings themselves?
And I know that Erica and Eric have been talking about this, and they've identified some areas that they think are problematic themselves, and I think it's related to this. So I don't know if Eric or Erica, you want to talk about that and needing clarity there as well.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. This is Erica, associate planner at the city. I'll jump in, Erica, if you have anything else to add. In terms of design standards, we do have the site plan review matrix, and so multifamily buildings would be part of that. So there are design standards. If it's a mixed-use building, those site plan review, design standards for commercial / mixed-use buildings would apply. So we do have design standards for those buildings, although they could certainly be updated. There are some, I guess, conflicts, you could say. It really kind of depends on how and where the multifamily is located within the commercial development. So a lot of those standards are going to want the building to be close to the street, for example, while, a lot of these new multifamily buildings are like in the rear, they're like infill, and so it could be difficult to meet some of those standards. So it's just when you actually apply the code for some of these infill projects, it's not a great, not a really clean application. So those would have to be worked around. I guess that could be cleaned up as well.
Awesome. Tim, do you have a comment on Gene's comment or something else?
Well, Eric brought up another concern I just wanted to throw out there too, and maybe this is better addressed once we get to the comprehensive plan update, but I'm also a little concerned about the interface between our commercial areas and our residential areas and what that transition looks like. And as an example of some a bad practice is like our new hotel over off of Murdoch, where you have a multi-story building that's looking into the backyards of a lot of the homes around there. So I don't know if that's something we should address now, but that's definitely something that I think we need to talk about in our code. And what does that interface look like? What's that transition look like from residential all the way into commercial?
Thanks, Tim. Gene, with your question, if the direction that we wanted to do is to preserve, and say the first floor of buildings needs to remain commercial and residential could go above, then like I said, I'm not concerned about what we label the housing as density, but it might be important to your other part of your question of design standard for that structure. If we didn't want to require all buildings to have ground floor commercial and had allowed some ground floor residential, then I would be falling back to high density standards. That's what. But I'm not. If I was to have a choice or a preference with my thought process at this point, is an easier approach just to say first floor has got to be commercial. It can't be the parking that Tim described, and you have to limit the amount of staircases in the structure, and then let some creativity happen. Recognizing the importance of proximity to any residential zone areas from a height perspective. And then, just to say it, I'm also concerned if PUD can be used to work around any of this stuff. So I would want clarity in the PUD code that says your only flexibility, in this kind of a mixed use approach in commercial is blank. And maybe that's more height if you're far enough away from residential areas, as an example.
Mr. Mayor, if I may.
Oh, I apologize. Yes, Doug.
So something I neglected to mention earlier that I wanted to make sure we talked about as well is, kind of the idea of the concept of phasing in a mixed-use development.
Yep.
I think the way the code exists now, it's possible for a development to be approved that would meet the requirements of, being primarily commercial, but that the residential portion of that development could be constructed first, right away, goes to occupancy, and then the commercial portion, may get built 2 years from now, maybe never. And I don't know that we have any way to prevent that. And I think that's maybe a tricky way to circumvent the existing code, whether intentionally or not, just through market forces. So I'd want to make sure that we have language that says, at any point in time, whatever our metrics end up being, right? If it's square footage or, percentage of the ground floor or whatever, that at any point in time throughout the process that metric has to be met, as far as instead of from an approved plan standpoint, whether it's from what's been permitted or what's been billed or what's been given an occupancy permit or whatever the right whatever that right gating point is for staff to manage. I'm on board with whatever it is, but I think that's a key component of this, because otherwise you can easily game the system. I don't want to say easily, but the system could be gamed, without that kind of standard applied.
Great point, Doug. Yeah, if the community approves a project and a concept, the community is in supportive and wants to see it all built, or built in a reasonable phased approach. Yeah.
And I might suggest, because this is going to take a lot of thought and thinking through exactly what we want down the road, but maybe in the short term, mixed use is limited to the building. I mean, Doug, I think the example you're talking about is you might have a large development where it's apartments here, a theater here, whatever it might be.
Right.
In the short term here, we have it referred specifically to the building, that the building has to be commercial on the ground floor, residential, or whatever you want to do.
If we did the ground floor thing, obviously that's going to take care of itself. But if we went with a more of a blended metric approach across the plan, right? If you were building 3 buildings and one of them is a residential building, one's a mixed and one's a commercial, nothing in the current code would prevent the residential building from getting built and the other two to sit there in planning mode for years. And that, I think, is not the intent of what we're trying to get after with allowing this mixed development.
Yeah.
What do other folks think?
You don't have to raise your hand. You can just unmute and share your thoughts or questions.
I've thought. I'll go.
Yeah.
So as I recall, Gina and I were on the Planning Commission when a different long-standing development within the Sherwood city limits was going to propose maybe putting some apartments or whatever on the back portion of the property. It might have been slightly different. And there were, I can't remember exactly why it wasn't built, but and there were quite a few things that we went through the Planning Commission, a lot of things that we looked at. Do you remember that, Gene? That, what I'm talking about? And so I was looking at the other.
Why it didn't happen.
Okay, well, maybe, okay. So is what I'm asking is this The other location across the road clearly seems like, we thought it was going to be some kind of hotel or commercial, and suddenly if it becomes something else, whereas the former, I'm just trying to think of my experience, it was clearly behind. It was adjacent to other high density residential areas. So this one does seem to be really out. It seems to be completely different. So, but that's what I'm asking, maybe Julie and Erica. So our current code allows for both situations. So, for example, if we went forward with what the mayor said, then the other development behind, and we required them to have, commercial on the bottom floor. I don't know what that would look like. That's it, because it seemed like whatever that was seeming like it was headed in the correct direction. The other one, as I look at the map, kind of makes sense, but this is I don't know where we delineate. If our code covers both of those types of properties, then it's definitely complicated. Do you have any thoughts on that, Gene?
I think I've heard the phrase, once you let the camel's nose under the tent, he goes all the way in. And if you let a little bit of residential in your commercial, then you end up opening the door very wide. And if the council's concern and direction is to help preserve the commercial area, I think then we need to be strict and limit and well-defined that it will be only if the building contains commercial on the first floor, you have the ability to put some residential on upper floors, and that would be an immediate fix. And then if we wanted to go back and revisit and see how that worked, if it was too restrictive, it's easier to be less restrictive in the future than it is to try and tighten it up later. Because if we wanted to try and figure out what percentage of land would need to be a commercial building before we built out the rest of it residential, if you had 10 acres, how do you divide it? It gets really muddy. So
and it may be that that's appropriate, for a planned unit development. Maybe it's sort of here's the standard for mixed use in a commercial zone. If you want something a little bit more unique, then it's a PUD, and be really strict with the standard, but then entertain the idea of maybe allowing a standalone residential through a different process if you want to. I mean, that's just an idea.
I think that might be the best approach, thinking about it, right? If you just had a very strict first floor has to be 100% commercial, then you can do whatever you want above that. And then if you want to go through the PUD process, then that gives us an opportunity to say, you know what, this development, they're proposing, these two really awesome mixed use buildings, and then behind it as a buffer between the mixed use and a residential zone that's already in existence, they just want a complete residential building. You know what, that might make sense. Let's not like try to guess at what all the parameters we need to put into play are, and yeah, you can handle that through a PUD, and that, I like that. I like that. It seems clean, and obviously we're going to get another crack at it in a year or so as we go through the code updates for the comp plan. So maybe this is the easy way to do the stopgap.
So, and just to be clear, and Erica and or Eric can.
With the PUD idea, I think we need a lot more gnawing on it.
Yeah.
The Safari Sam's parcel that was approved a while back and never went anywhere. It's a land lease, and there wasn't enough years left on it for anybody to pencil out to make any sense to do it. If that ever came forward again, it makes it's much more logical sense in that example, part of a comp plan review, to literally look at rezoning. Right. Part of that parcel, or the whole. Nothing will happen there. They'll wait until the whole thing gets redeveloped in 20 years and the land lease is up, or renewed. So I'd just be cautious on the PUD, how we treat a PUD.
I like Doug's comment about maybe we should be, or I guess it was somebody's comment about, being more restrictive initially and then. That was Dean. Okay, and then easing up if needed, because as I think more and more and more about the other more recent location and reading through the comment by one of the local residents. Some of those items they listed, not all of them, but I think some of those items are extremely valid. I mean, we all know an apartment building is an apartment building, and people will park wherever they can, which could encroach on nearby spaces. I mean, all those things that we don't really want that to happen. So,
well, it's like anything we do as a planning commission and as a city council, we do not want to, and we shouldn't want to increase conflict between neighbors.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm going to ask Daniel to talk in just a quick second, but yeah, we want. So the one element that is good in the code that was done in 12 is the concept of shared parking, because parking standards are not really set by us locals that much anymore. Good or bad, it is just the reality. So the one element where we do still have the control is to define if they can utilize shared parking or not, and when there might not be enough commercial parking to begin with, or there might not be enough residential parking to begin with in a mixed use area, that maybe by having that all together, but the total required in one and the total required in the other is still all there, then that should help minimize problems with neighbors. Daniel. Yeah, your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm in agreement with just about everybody here. It sounds like where we're headed. I'm not outright opposed to some kind of mixed use, especially where you have retail on the ground floor and then apartments above. I agree the code is vague. I understand the ramifications of that, but we just have to be careful. I guess my question is, I'm just wondering if we have a sense as to, we can't be the first city dealing with this, I wouldn't think. And I'm wondering if we have a sense as to how other cities, maybe our size or similar, have handled this before, whether it's through the PUD process or through just outright zoning. There's other places where this stuff exists, and do we have a sense for that? Maybe that could help inform our track here, my thought.
So yes and no. Again, we've had this as an opportunity in our code for at least as long as 1987. So, we have a track record of it as well. I guess is my point. And there are certainly some situations in Sherwood where we have ground floor and residential on the top, and other jurisdictions certainly have standards, and we can do a little bit more research as we move forward to give you that perspective. I think that many jurisdictions are probably going to have higher allowances for buildings and potentially higher density. So we'd have to find a city that's very comparable to Sherwood in terms of our heights and densities that we allow. I mean, we don't want to compare ourselves to Tigard, for instance, because they're going to allow much more than Sherwood does.
Yep, they've got greater access to mass transit and other things. Tim.
Yeah, just to riff on that whole concept a little bit more, one thing to keep in mind, especially for people that might be listening to this conversation, in Sherwood here, we're about 85% residential. And so commercial land is at a premium. And, so in part of our council visioning and our goals for the cities is to bring more jobs to Sherwood, live and work in Sherwood, and restore some of that balance. A lot of the cities around us aren't like that. They might be 50-50. And so they kind of have different challenges around this. So I think it is important that we're really careful about preserving the commercial land that we do have, as we move forward. Just wanted to point that out for those that might be listening to this conversation. Oh, can I just add one more thing too? And it's not just about growth in Sherwood that we need that commercial land. We have Beaverton, King City, the whole South Cooper Mountain moving our way, a lot of development coming that way. Those people are going to be generating trips into Sherwood too, looking for places to buy their groceries, go to the movies, and do all those things. So it's not just about having commercial retail space available for our constituents. It's the region as well.
I just want, so I'm hearing definitely a consensus from both the council and the planning commission to do some changes sooner rather than later. And I think we've gotten some good direction on the way you want to lean. And so I think we can probably get something pulled together fairly quickly. That said, I don't want you to be surprised if there's an application that's submitted prior to us being done. And I know you all know, but I feel like I have to say it. If an application is submitted, the standards that are in effect at the time the application is submitted is what rules. And so especially for some of the newer planning commissioners, I just want you to be prepared that you might be asked to make a decision on something that is not in line exactly with this, depending on whether or not an application is submitted prior to us being done.
Yep, that's the rule of certainty. You know, you can't change the rules after someone has standing.
Do you have a sense for the timing?
Eric or Erica, do you know? I know they did a neighborhood meeting, which is kind of what spurred the initial conversation. Do you guys know when they're planning on submitting?
Yeah, I would expect an application to come in probably within the next month.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm not, this application, should it happen, it is what it is. A good chance it happens before we can enact any changes, and that, whatever. I mean, I'm not out. To me, this conversation is more important in the bigger picture, and than any one site. So, if we're late on something and we can't do something about one parcel of land, we can fix it for the next one.
And I think it's really important, and I'm glad that we're saying that, because this is about a much bigger picture, and we are hearing from potential developers on other commercially zoned land of this interest, and so it really is getting in front of it as best we can, not responding to a specific development issue or responding to a bigger potentiality. That's the word.
And it's kind of interesting. We're, as a community, we certainly have some vacant land, but we also have some land that's of a certain age that, has the potential for redevelopment. So it'd be important in both categories.
May I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
My wife, in discussing this topic tonight before the meeting, said, well, don't we just have a crap ton of vacant commercial land currently? I mean, that's kind of her. I think that's a common purview. Well, most of our vacant land in town is empty businesses, commercial land, right? We've got the the undeveloped stuff out by Walmart. We've got some of the facilities over by the Kilt Brewing place, et cetera. There's quite a few semi-vacant to vacant commercial properties on them. And so it's just a public perception question, really, right? I mean, what is our occupancy of our already built commercial structure as a percentage versus undeveloped as well? Do we know?
I think it's pretty high. I'm only personally aware of a couple, three storefronts, in a strip mall that have vacancies off the top of my head.
I think the question is, it's the difference between vacant land and vacant storefronts. And so I'm not sure if you're asking about vacant land or storefronts. And we certainly can tell you the vacant land, and anecdotally, and probably Bruce, our economic development manager, could tell you more specifically the vacant storefronts.
It was just an observation, right? I mean, and I think you're right. I mean, I think there's a perception, but I can't come up with very many vacant buildings myself. So,
yeah.
Mike, you might be referring to industrial versus commercial as well.
I think you're right, sir. You're right, Justin. I think that's the misperception.
Yep.
And as Tim alluded, things that are happening around us, around our community development, as well as within our community, there's a growing need once we get on the other side of this pandemic that's going to get unleashed, I think, on the commercial side, industrial side. We're seeing still is strong. But all the projects that, you know, in my commute, when I go to my office in Beaverton, I see they're building all these homes, all these units, and there is not a thing for them to do anywhere near it. So they're going to be driving to Sherwood, or they're going to be driving into Tigard, or driving into Progress Ridge, Beaverton kind of area, for it. So we're running out of time, Gene. We need to get.
I was gonna raising my hand, alert of a time thing. We have 3 minutes to take a break, and then all the commissioners need to log off and go on to our regular scheduled meeting. I really appreciate the mayor and council taking the time to give perspective and help us do a better job and get projects through to you that are effective and helpful to what the goals are for the city and for the council. So thank you.
Oh, thank you all for letting us join your meeting today by having the work session. We greatly appreciate it, and continue to thank all the hard work you guys are doing. Your plates are full, and we're giving you a little extra bit here in the next month. But we thanks in advance for adding it to your plate.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, see you later. We all have 2 minutes to pop off and go